A bankrupt millionaire let a beggar girl sleep in his restaurant for one night. The next day, the millionaire was stunned by what the girl did in the place. The streets of downtown New Orleans were nearly empty when Emma crept into the alley behind the restaurants. Her unkempt black hair partially covered her thin, pale face, while her dark, attentive eyes examined every movement around her. Wearing tattered clothes and a torn sneaker, the 12-year-old girl moved like a shadow between the restaurant dumpsters. The smell of food wafting from the eateries made her stomach ache even more. She hadn't eaten anything but scraps for 3 days, and the hunger was becoming unbearable. In her mind, she could hear the voice of her late mother echoing, "My little Emma, a true chef never wastes food." "Please, God," she murmured to herself, her hands trembling as she opened one of the busiest restaurant's dumpsters. "I just need something to not go to sleep hungry today. Mama always said food is sacred, that it shouldn't be wasted. So why do they throw so much away?" One of the most traditional restaurants in the area was closing its doors for the night. Emma discreetly watched the last satisfied customers leaving the place, while she carefully rummaged through the discarded leftovers. Her small, skilled hands, even if dirty, moved with the delicacy of someone who once knew the art of gastronomy. Among the discards, she found some still packaged pieces of bread and a portion of practically untouched rice. The aroma of Mexican seasoning brought tears to her eyes as she remembered the days when she helped her mother in the kitchen. Across the street, Walter ended another frustrating night at his nearly empty restaurant. The Collins restaurant, once one of the most prestigious in New Orleans, now barely managed to attract customers. As he closed the curtains, his eyes caught Emma's furtive movement in the alley. Something about her frail, determined figure caught his attention, making him hesitate before locking the doors. What a disgrace! "Again, this beggar who looks more like a sick rat is rummaging through my trash," shouted Jose, the restaurant owner, angrily emerging through the back door. His flushed, angry face contrasted with his immaculate white apron. His shouts echoed through the nearly empty street, attracting curious glances from the few people still passing by. "How many times do I have to kick you out of here, you little thief? You're scaring my customers with that appearance. As if I don't have enough problems, now I have to deal with people like you too." Emma tried to explain, her voice trembling with fear and shame. "Sir, please, I was just looking for something to eat. I promise I won't make a mess. I'll only take what's going to be thrown away. Please have mercy." Before she could finish her plea, she felt the jet of cold water hitting her frail body with force. Jose had grabbed the cleaning hose and was mercilessly directing it at the girl. The icy water cut like knives on her skin, drenching her already worn clothes. "I'm going to start cleaning the filth from my sidewalk. Get out of here, you scrawny rat, and don't come back or I'll call the police," he yelled, while more curious customers gathered to watch the humiliating scene. Walter, still standing at the door of his restaurant, felt his stomach churn at the cruelty of the scene. His own desperate situation seemed small in the face of that girl's suffering. He wanted to intervene, to put a stop to that humiliation. But before he could cross the street, the situation took a drastic turn for the worse. A group of teenagers who used to roam the area, known for tormenting vulnerable people, began chasing Emma. The leader of the group, a young man in a tattered leather jacket, began to laugh and point. "Look at the wet little rat," he shouted as his accomplices gathered stones from the ground. "Go look for food somewhere else, filth. This is no place for street rats." Emma ran desperately, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode. The laughter and insults of her pursuers echoed through the street, while more stones flew in her direction. One nearly hit her shoulder, making her scream in fright, but she couldn't stop. Her legs trembled with fatigue and hunger, but fear gave her strength to continue. "Please stop, I didn't do anything to you," she cried between sobs, but her words only seemed to fuel her pursuers' cruelty even more. More stones were thrown, one of them grazing her head, breaking a window of a building they were passing. The pursuit continued relentlessly, with Emma running faster and faster, her frail legs barely supporting her malnourished body. The teenagers wouldn't give up, turning her suffering into a perverse amusement. "Let's see if the rodent can dodge too," one of them shouted, throwing more stones and trash in her direction. In her desperation to escape, Emma didn't realize she was approaching a construction area next to the Collins restaurant. The night was especially dark in that stretch, as the streetlights were turned off due to the construction. Her bare feet barely touched the ground as she ran, and her tears mingled with the water still streaming from her clothes. Walter saw the imminent danger and began shouting desperately, "Be careful, girl, stop! There's a big hole!" But his words were swallowed by the darkness of the night and the shouts of her pursuers. In a matter of seconds, Emma disappeared into the darkness. A piercing, terrified scream cut through the night, followed by the dull thud of a body falling. The construction pit, nearly 3 meters deep, had swallowed the girl like a cruel trap of fate. The teenagers, frightened by the consequences of their actions, fled quickly, leaving only the echo of their hurried footsteps in the night. "My lord," exclaimed Walter, running towards the accident site. Even with his financial troubles and his restaurant teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, he didn't hesitate to help. Fate had put that little girl in his path, and something in his heart told him he couldn't abandon her. Approaching the edge of the hole, he could see Emma's tiny body lying motionless on the ground. Water from the hose was still trickling down her torn clothes, forming a small puddle beneath her frail body. "Girl, can you hear me?" he called, his heart racing with concern. A faint moan was his only answer. Walter looked around, desperate for help, but the street was deserted. The decision had to be made quickly. That child needed immediate aid, and he was her only hope. "Hang in there, little one," he murmured, searching for a way to get down to her. "I'll get you out of there no matter how." The next day the sun had barely risen when Walter descended the stairs of his small apartment above Colin's restaurant. The previous night still weighed heavily on his conscience. After rescuing Emma from the hole, he hadn't had the heart to leave her alone, especially after finding that her injuries, though minor, required care. Besides the scratches, the girl was shivering from the cold due to her soaked clothes. Against all prudence, he had offered the small pantry room of the restaurant for her to spend the night, along with some old clothes he kept for donation. "It's just for one night," he had told himself. "Tomorrow we'll sort this out properly." As he descended the last few steps, his thoughts turned to the restaurant's problems. Debts were piling up, customers were becoming increasingly rare, and not even Margaret, his second wife and manager, could find a solution. Colin's restaurant, once one of the most prestigious in New Orleans, now seemed destined for bankruptcy. An unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed coffee and Mexican spices invaded his nostrils as he opened the door leading to the kitchen. His heart raced, thinking someone had broken into the restaurant during the night. The scent was so familiar, so comforting, that for a moment he thought he was dreaming of the restaurant's glory days. But what he found left him completely paralyzed. The kitchen, which had been practically abandoned for months, was now pulsing with new life. The copper pots, so long unused, shone under the morning light streaming through the windows. The industrial stove, so silent in recent times, now danced with several lit flames, each tending to a different preparation. Emma moved with surprising familiarity among the stoves and counters, her small hands working with the precision of a professional. The girl who had seemed so fragile and frightened the night before now commanded that space as if she had been born there. Her black hair was neatly braided, and she wore one of the restaurant's aprons, folded several times to fit her petite frame. On the main counter, typical Mexican dishes were arranged with impeccable presentation. Freshly steamed green pancakes decorated with fresh cream and grated cotija cheese. The aroma emanating from each plate was so authentic, so deeply Mexican, that Walter felt his eyes well up with tears. "Good morning, Mr. Walter," she said shyly, but with a different sparkle in her eyes. It was no longer the frightened look of the night before, but something alive, passionate. "I wanted to thank you for what you did for me last night. I know I shouldn't have used your kitchen without permission, but cooking is the only way I know how to show gratitude. When I saw all this equipment, these pots, I couldn't resist." Walter slowly approached the central table, where a breakfast worthy of the best restaurants in New Orleans was served. The aroma of café de olla, traditionally prepared with cinnamon, mingled with the fragrance of freshly baked sweet breads. Still warm pretzels displayed their characteristic sugary tops, and a variety of fresh-cut fruits adorned each plate with vibrant colors. How did you manage to do all this?" he asked, still astonished, picking up one of the breads and feeling its perfectly crunchy exterior and soft inside. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" As she nervously adjusted the oversized apron on her slender frame, Emma began to explain, My mother always said the kitchen was our real home. She was a chef, you know, Grace Parker, and my father, James Parker, was a pastry specialist. They had a famous restaurant in Miami until... Her voice faltered for a moment and Walter saw her eyes fill with tears, but she took a deep breath and continued, until the accident happened. After that, I was alone. But they taught me everything about cooking from a very young age. Mom said I had the gift, that food spoke to me the way it spoke to her. Walter sat down, his legs wobbly with the revelation. Grace and James Parker. Those names were legends in Mexican cuisine. His own restaurant had unsuccessfully tried to replicate some of their famous recipes years ago. The Parker couple had revolutionized traditional Mexican cooking, elevating simple dishes into gastronomic works of art. "You're the Parker's daughter?" he asked, his voice trembling. "But everyone thought there were no survivors from the accident," the papers said. Emma's small hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee into an antique porcelain cup. "I was at school when it happened. Afterwards, no one wanted to believe a child claiming to be their daughter. I ended up on the streets because it was better than going to an orphanage where no one would believe me. At least on the streets I could keep cooking, even if only in my imagination." Walter watched in awe as he tasted each dish. The flavors were unmistakable, the same complexity, the same perfect balance that had made the Parkers famous. It was as if the glorious past of Mexican cuisine had come back to life in his very kitchen. "Mom's favorite dishes," Emma explained, a shy smile playing on her lips. "She used to say breakfast was the most important meal because it carries the hopes of a new day, and that every dish tells a story, has a soul." Walter was about to respond when he heard the familiar sound of high heels coming down the back stairs. Margaret, his second wife and the restaurant's manager, always arrived early to check the accounts, which had only been getting worse in recent months. The sound of her heels echoed down the corridor like an omen. "Walter, why does it smell like food at this hour? You know we can't afford to waste ingredients on..." Margaret's voice died in her throat as she entered the kitchen. Her eyes, usually cold and calculating, widened in shock at the sight of Emma. All color drained from her face, as if she had seen a ghost. Her hands began to tremble violently, dropping the file of documents she was carrying. "It's not. It can't be," she whispered, staggering backwards. "You can't. You're..." Before she could finish the sentence, Margaret fainted, falling against a decorative glass table they kept in the hallway. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the empty restaurant as Walter rushed to help his wife, and Emma watched the scene with an expression of pure terror on her face. "Walter," Margaret murmured as he held her, her voice almost inaudible. "That girl, you don't know. You don't understand." Her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness entirely, leaving an unsettling question hanging in the air. How could his wife know the Parker's daughter? Minutes after Margaret's collapse, the ambulance that had come to her rescue was cutting through the streets of New Orleans with its siren blaring, while Walter firmly held his wife's hand inside the vehicle. Before leaving, he had asked Yolanda to take care of Emma. "Take her to our home, give her a warm bath and clean clothes, and then prepare her something to eat. She's far too thin." The housekeeper, who had been working for the family for 15 years, nodded silently as she watched the ambulance depart. Margaret's pale face and her inexplicable reaction to seeing the girl had left everyone on high alert. But there was something more in Yolanda's gaze, a kind of recognition that she preferred to keep to herself. In the emergency room, doctors were examining Margaret with meticulous care. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, her body trembling, and she alternated between moments of lucidity and periods of confusion. Walter waited anxiously outside, pacing back and forth in the sterile hospital corridor. His thoughts swung between concern for his wife and the surprising revelation about Emma. The legendary Parker's daughter, living as a beggar on the streets of New Orleans? Fate sometimes had a cruel sense of humor. "How did I not realize it sooner?" he muttered to himself, running his hands through his graying hair. That breakfast had the unmistakable signature of the Parkers, the way it was prepared, the presentation, even the little details that made their dishes so special. Only someone trained by them could reproduce those flavors with such precision. "Mr. Collins," the doctor called, emerging from the examination room with a clipboard in hand. Your wife suffered a severe drop in blood pressure, likely caused by extreme stress. The tests show clear signs of exhaustion. These last few months have been difficult? Walter nodded, thinking of the mounting debts, the dwindling customers, the nights when Margaret pored over the restaurant's account books. She's conscious now and asking to see you, but I recommend strict bed rest for the next few days. Margaret was reclining on the gurney when Walter entered, her face assuming a studied, serene expression. A cold sweat still glistened on her brow, and the heart monitor beside her showed an irregular rhythm. "Walter, I'm sorry for the scare," she said, her voice controlled but weak. "It was the shock of seeing a beggar in our kitchen. With all the problems we've been facing, it was too much for me. You know how sensitive I am." "Margaret," he began, sitting by his wife's side and taking her cold hand, "that girl is no mere beggar. She's Emma Parker, daughter of the famous chefs Grace and James Parker." As he mentioned the names, he noticed her fingers tighten around his and a shadow pass over her eyes. "And you need to see what she did in the kitchen. It was like the restaurant's glory days had returned. That talent, it runs in the family." "Parker?" Margaret replied with a nervous laugh that sounded false even to herself. "Walter, dear, you can't be so naive, believing everything a street girl says. The Parkers died years ago in an accident, everyone knows that." It was a terrible tragedy, but her hands trembled as she arranged her hair, and her eyes avoided meeting her husband's with a suspicious insistence. The doctor returned with more test results and an extensive prescription. "You need to avoid strong emotions in the coming days," he warned, adjusting his glasses. "High blood pressure can be very dangerous, and your body is showing clear signs of exhaustion. I recommend absolute rest for at least a week." Margaret nodded, but her face showed a concern that went far beyond the medical diagnosis. During the drive back home, Walter drove in silence, occasionally casting worried glances at his wife. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the window, her mind clearly elsewhere. The sun was beginning to set over New Orleans, painting the sky in shades of orange that reminded her of the colors of the restaurant kitchen in its heyday. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the heavy silence, "that girl needs help, Margaret. You saw her talent in the kitchen. Maybe we could offer her a job, give her a chance to get back on her feet." Margaret turned abruptly, her face pale again. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Walter, we can't trust a street girl. What if she steals something? What if she's dangerous? Besides, we barely have enough money to keep the restaurant running." "But you saw what she did this morning," Walter insisted. "Those dishes, they were perfect. And what if she really is the Parker's daughter? Think of what that could mean for the restaurant." "Walter, please." Margaret gripped her husband's arm tightly. "You can't believe that absurd story. The Parkers are dead. Everyone knows that. This girl is clearly lying to gain your sympathy. We have to be very careful. I'm worried that we're being deceived by a criminal." The rest of the drive went by in a tense silence. Margaret breathed a sigh of relief when they finally arrived home, thinking she had managed to dissuade her husband from that absurd idea. Leaning on the railing, she climbed the stairs slowly, planning to take her medicines and rest. In the upstairs hallway, she stopped to catch her breath, her mind still agitated by the day's events. "I need to get rid of this threat," she muttered to herself, clenching her fists until her knuckles turned white. Her thoughts were interrupted when she reached her bedroom door. Margaret took a deep breath, composed her rehearsed expression of frailty, and turned the knob. As she opened the door, however, her face lost all color again. There, in the hallway leading to her room, was Emma. But she was no longer the dirty and ragged beggar from the morning. The girl wore a simple but clean dress. Her hair, still damp from bathing, was carefully combed, and her clean face revealed a disturbing, and now undeniable, resemblance to Grace Parker. "Good evening, Mrs. Margaret," Emma said softly, her voice carrying an education that completely contradicted her supposed life on the streets. "Yolanda helped me settle into the guest room, as Mr. Walter asked. I hope you're feeling better." But Margaret barely heard the girl's words. Her eyes were fixed on something Emma was holding in her hands, an old recipe book with the name Parker engraved on the cover, which she had found in the house's library. A book that Margaret thought she had destroyed years ago, along with all other evidence of her past. Margaret fixed her eyes on the recipe book in Emma's hands, her mind quickly processing every detail of the unexpected situation. Years of managing other people's restaurants had taught her that the best plans are those made calmly and precisely. In a matter of seconds, her shocked expression transformed into a sweet, maternal smile, a mask she had perfected over the years. The pale hospital face gave way to a radiant expression as she approached Emma with soft steps, ignoring the dizziness she still felt. "What a wonderful treasure you found in our library, dear," Margaret said, her melodious voice echoing through the hallway as she gently touched the book. Her eyes studied every detail of Emma's face, now clean and even more like Grace. The resemblance was disturbing, but Margaret kept her smile fixed, years of practice at hiding her true intentions, allowing her to change personalities like changing clothes. Walter watched the scene from the foot of the stairs, his heart warming at his wife's apparent change of attitude. Emma, still holding the book close to her chest, as if it were her most precious possession, alternated looks between the two adults with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The smell of freshly cooked food rose from the kitchen, where Yolanda was finalizing dinner, creating a deceptively welcoming atmosphere. "Walter, darling," Margaret seized the moment to amplify her performance, descending a few steps to stand beside her husband. "I know I was a bit hasty earlier today. The shock, you understand. But now seeing this little one so clean and tidy, I can see that she really has something special. That breakfast, it was truly extraordinary. Every word was carefully chosen, like ingredients in a poisonous recipe." Dinner was served at the old jacaranda table in the dining room, a relic from the Collins' prosperous times. Margaret made sure to seat Emma by her side, filling the girl's plate with generous portions. Between bites, she asked seemingly innocent questions about culinary techniques and family recipes. Each of Emma's answers was like a small confirmation of her identity, making Margaret's stomach churn, though her face maintained an interested expression. "You know, Walter," said Margaret between studied sips of red wine, her fingers toying with the crystal glass, "I've been thinking, perhaps I could help Emma adapt. After all, she needs a feminine figure to guide her, doesn't she? Someone who can teach her not only about cooking, but about how to behave properly in society." Her eyes met Yolanda's for a moment, and the maid felt an involuntary shiver. "But dear, don't you need to rest?" "The doctor recommended absolute rest," began Walter, genuinely concerned. Margaret interrupted him with a radiant smile, placing her hand over his on the table. "Nonsense. Nothing will do me better than having a purpose. I can teach Emma how to behave properly, take care of her education, prepare her to work at the restaurant appropriately. After all, we cannot have someone unrefined in our kitchen, can we?" While serving dessert, Yolanda watched the interaction with growing concern. She had known Margaret long enough to notice the subtle changes in her tone of voice, the calculating glint in her eyes when she looked at Emma. But how to warn Walter? How to protect the girl without concrete evidence? Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the pudding plates on the table. "Tomorrow we will begin your adaptation," announced Margaret with artificial enthusiasm. "For Yolanda can take care of the restaurant in the morning, while I show Emma how a true lady should behave. Afterwards, we can discuss how to integrate her talent into our kitchen." Her words sounded sweet, but carried a threatening undertone that only Yolanda and Emma seemed to perceive. Walter, completely enthralled by his wife's apparent kindness, smiled with satisfaction. "Margaret, you are truly wonderful," he said, affectionately squeezing his wife's hand. "I knew you would understand after the shock passed. Emma can be exactly what our restaurant needs to rise again." Margaret nodded, her smile never faltering, while her thoughts spun like gears planning each future move. After dinner, when Walter retired to make some calls in his office, Margaret insisted on personally showing the room where Emma would sleep. The room was at the end of the hallway, purposefully distant from the master bedroom. "It's a modest space," she said, turning on the yellowish light, "but I'm sure it will be better than the streets, won't it?" Her tone now carried an almost imperceptible note of cruelty. Yolanda hesitated in the kitchen doorway, her intuition screaming that something was wrong. Years of service had taught her to read the subtleties of her employer's behavior, and something about Margaret's demeanor left her deeply uneasy. "Mom, perhaps I should help Emma get settled," she offered timidly, but Margaret dismissed the suggestion with an elegant gesture. "It won't be necessary, Yolanda. You may retire." The tone brooked no discussion. The maid cast one last worried look at Emma before leaving, her heart heavy with a dark premonition. "Good night, ma'am." "Good night, little one," she murmured, her reluctant steps echoing down the back stairs. Finally alone with the girl in the guest room, Margaret closed the door softly, the click of the lock sounding like a sentence. Her sweet smile melted like hot wax, revealing an expression that made Emma instinctively recoil until she was pressed against the wall. The mask of kindness fell away completely, leaving a face contorted by years of bitterness and resentment. "So," she said, her voice now cutting like a knife, "you really survived. How inconvenient." Margaret approached slowly, each step calculated, like a predator cornering its prey. "Listen well, little Parker. This is my house, my restaurant, my life. I've spent years building all of this, and a surviving pest like you won't ruin my plans. I won't allow a little gutter rat to destroy everything I've achieved." "But, Mrs. Margaret," Emma stammered, clutching the recipe book to her chest like a shield. Her eyes, once bright with hope, were now wide with fear. Margaret snatched the book from her hands with a sharp motion, her red nails leaving small marks on the girl's hands. "Shut your cursed mouth! Not another word," she hissed, her voice just a threatening whisper that made Emma tremble. "Tomorrow, we'll begin your real training. And believe me, dear, you'll wish you had stayed in the gutters of the streets, scrapping for scraps with other animals just like you." With one last cruel smile, Margaret left the room, taking Emma's recipe book, the only link she had to her past. The door closed with a dull thud, leaving the girl alone in the dim light. While downstairs, Walter remained in his office, completely oblivious to his wife's true nature and the terror he had just authorized under his own roof. "It's not as easy as preparing those fancy dishes, is it?" taunted Margaret, slowly sipping her breakfast coffee as she watched the girl's suffering. "A true professional needs to start from the bottom, the very bottom." Her high heels intentionally left marks on the freshly cleaned floor, forcing Emma to restart the work several times. Yolanda arrived early, as usual, and her heart tightened at the sight. 15 years working for the Collins had never prepared her for such cruelty. "Mrs. Margaret, may I help with the cleaning while I prepare breakfast for the customers?" she timidly suggested, but was interrupted by a cutting look from her employer. "Don't meddle, Yolanda. Emma needs to learn her place, she needs to learn all aspects of the business." The morning dragged on at a torturous pace. The sun streaming through the restaurant windows transformed the environment into an oven, especially near the glass. Emma discreetly moved to a shaded area, but Margaret immediately redirected her to the most exposed spot. "The sun will help disinfect the floor better, dear. Keep going. I know the rats only run at night, so you'll get used to the daylight." The girl merely nodded, remembering her mother's words about perseverance and dignity, as silent tears streamed down her face. The aroma of fresh coffee that Yolanda prepared in the kitchen made Emma's stomach ache even more. Memories of the breakfast she had prepared the day before invaded her mind. How had everything changed so drastically in less than 24 hours? Her thoughts were interrupted by Walter's arrival, who rushed through the restaurant on his way to a meeting with suppliers. Seeing Emma cleaning the floor, Walter frowned, but Margaret swiftly intervened. "I'm teaching her all aspects of the business, dear. A true chef needs to know her kitchen inside out, doesn't she? It's part of the training I promised to give her." Her husband smiled, completely deceived by the explanation, and hurried off, leaving Emma even more vulnerable to Margaret's whims. In the kitchen, Yolanda prepared lunch with an increasingly heavy heart, occasionally casting worried glances at Emma. The girl had already cleaned half of the restaurant, but Margaret continued to find imperfections that needed to be redone. Her hands now trembled with exhaustion and hunger, but she kept scrubbing obstinately, fearing what Margaret might do if she stopped. When the first customers started arriving for lunch, Margaret ordered Emma to hide in the service area. "Get out of here. Your presence will only hurt the business," she said, shoving the girl into a dark, dusty corner. "Keep cleaning the wall tiles. And absolute silence. I don't want anyone knowing there's a beggar here." What would the customers think? The delicious smell of the food Yolanda prepared was a constant torture for Emma, who hadn't eaten anything since the night before. Her culinary knowledge screamed inside her as she sensed the aromas, knowing exactly which seasonings were missing from each dish. But Margaret's threats still echoed in her ears. "If you try to cook anything, you'll regret it bitterly." For hours, Emma continued her forced labor, her back aching from the uncomfortable position, her knees bruised from prolonged contact with the hard floor. Occasionally, she could hear the customers' comments about the food, some complaining that it wasn't up to the same level as before. Each criticism was like a small stab in her chef's heart. The lunch rush started to die down when Margaret entered the service area carrying a large pot of boiling oil. Her smile was particularly threatening, different from any expression she had shown thus far. "Emma, dear, come help me with this. I need to reheat it for dinner, and you should learn how to do it properly." Yolanda, who was organizing plates in the kitchen, felt a chill run down her spine at those words. In 15 years of work, she had never seen Margaret care about practical kitchen tasks. Something was terribly wrong. "Mom, I can take care of that," she began, but Margaret silenced her with a look that promised severe consequences if she interfered. "Come closer, girl," Margaret commanded, positioning Emma exactly where she wanted her. "I need you to see how to do this properly." Her movements were calculated, her eyes fixed on the girl like a predator about to strike. The oil bubbled dangerously in the pot, and Margaret's smile grew more sinister. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Margaret tripped, tilting the pot of boiling oil towards Emma. Yolanda screamed a desperate warning, her hands dropping the plates she held with a crash that echoed through the silent kitchen. The deadly golden liquid began its trajectory towards the defenseless girl, reflecting the kitchen light like a river of liquid fire. At the last second, Yolanda managed to push Emma aside, causing the boiling oil to spill onto the floor instead of hitting the girl. The sound of the shattered plate still echoed through the kitchen as Margaret regained her composure, her face a mask of false concern. Her well-manicured hands adjusted her perfectly styled hair, while her eyes revealed a mixture of frustration and contained rage. "Oh my, how clumsy of me! Are you both all right?" Her sweet voice didn't match the malignant glint in her gaze as she saw her plan had failed. Emma trembled against the kitchen wall, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode. A few drops of the hot oil had nearly splashed on her arm. The smell of burnt oil mixed with the aroma of the dishes being prepared for dinner, creating a suffocating atmosphere. Thanks to Yolanda's quick action, she had escaped a much worse fate. The maid, still gasping from the shock, began cleaning up the porcelain shards, casting worried glances at Margaret, who seemed increasingly irritated by the failure of her attempt. "What a lamentable mess," Margaret sighed theatrically, her high heel tapping rhythmically on the kitchen floor as she circled around the two of them. "Emma, dear, since you're so interested in learning about the restaurant, how about getting to know our main dining room? Customers are arriving for dinner, and we need someone to clear the tables." Her cruel smile made it clear that the humiliation in the kitchen hadn't been enough. She needed an audience for her next act of cruelty. The main dining room of Colin's restaurant, once an elegant and welcoming place, now seemed like an arena where Emma would be exposed to ridicule. The crystal chandeliers, which once symbolized the establishment's luxury, now looked like cruel spotlights focused on the girl. Margaret made sure to position her in full view of all the customers, ordering her to clean each table with exaggerated movements. The borrowed dress, already soiled and stained from the hard work, contrasted painfully with the refined decor of the setting. "Look at this," Margaret began to comment aloud to the arriving customers, her voice laden with false compassion. "We're giving a chance to this poor little thing we found on the street. So touching, isn't it? She used to sleep between the trash cans, you know. We're trying to civilize her, but it's such a slow process." Her malicious comments made the customers look at Emma with a mixture of pity and discomfort. Some whispered among themselves, others averted their gaze, embarrassed. For hours, Margaret continued her show of false charity, making sure to emphasize Emma's humble origins to each new customer who arrived. The girl kept her head down, her hands trembling as she tried to continue her work with dignity. In her mind echoed her mother's words about pride and perseverance, but each cruel comment from Margaret was like a stab in her already hurt heart. When the dinner rush began to subside, Margaret decided to deliver the final blow to her performance. Pointing to some plates with food scraps, she ordered with a wicked smile, "Since you were so used to looking for food in the trash, you can have your meal with the leftovers. In the storage room, of course. We wouldn't want to disturb our refined customers with unpleasant scenes." Without waiting for a response, she shoved Emma into the small storage room at the back of the dining room. Yolanda, who had been watching the whole thing with a broken heart, waited for Margaret to walk away before acting. Discreetly, she prepared a plate of hot and fresh food, adding extra ingredients she knew the girl would enjoy. "Eat quickly, little one," she whispered as she entered the storage room, caressing the girl's hair. "And don't let her break your spirit. You are so much more than she says. You're a Parker, never forget that." As she hurriedly ate in the dark of the storage room, Emma couldn't hold back her sobs. Margaret's cruel words still echoed in her mind, mingling with the memories of her parents and the restaurant that once belonged to them. With trembling hands, she began to season the food that Yolanda had brought, an automatic habit inherited from her mother. Each spice she added was like a small act of resistance, a way to keep her family's legacy alive. In the dining room, Margaret continued her role as a benefactor, receiving praise from some customers for her kindness in helping a street girl. Her moment of triumph, however, was abruptly interrupted by a surprised exclamation from a nearby table. An elderly customer, who had received a plate that Yolanda had prepared following Emma's secret instructions, had his eyes wide with astonishment, his fork suspended in the air. "This seasoning," the man muttered, his voice trembling with emotion as he caught everyone's attention around him. "This preparation technique, I would recognize it anywhere. It's the unmistakable signature of the Parkers." Margaret froze in the middle of the dining room, her face losing all color as the man continued. "But how is it possible? Their restaurant closed years ago after that terrible accident, unless—" His eyes turned to the storage room where Emma was hidden, a sudden understanding illuminating his wrinkled face. The news that someone had recognized the Parkers' seasoning spread quickly throughout New Orleans. The next morning, Colin's restaurant was surprisingly full, with curious customers eager to taste the dishes that reminded them of the legendary family of chefs. The dark wooden tables, once empty, were now occupied by people excitedly commenting on the possibility of savoring those unique flavors again. Walter, excited by the sudden influx, finally gave in to the customers' requests and allowed Emma to help in the kitchen. Margaret watched everything with a forced smile, her calculating eyes studying each of the girl's movements, her red nails nervously drumming on the counter. "We need to be careful with this situation," Margaret muttered to Walter as Emma prepared the first dishes of the day. "She's still a street girl, dear. We can't entrust our entire restaurant to her. What if she ruins everything? What if it's just a stroke of luck?" But her husband, excited by the packed tables, merely waved distractedly. The sound of cutlery and lively conversations filled the atmosphere in a way it hadn't in months, and the hope of regaining lost prestige left him blind to his wife's manipulations. In the kitchen, Emma moved with the natural grace of someone born for that work. Her small hands danced between spices and pans, recreating the recipes her mother had taught her with so much love. The aroma of fresh spices and bubbling sauces filled the air, transporting everyone back to the glorious days of Mexican gastronomy. Yolanda watched in wonder, occasionally wiping away a discreet tear as she recognized the gestures that so resembled Grace Parker. "It's like seeing a good ghost," thought the employee, "but I need to stay vigilant. Margaret won't accept this easily." It was during the big lunch rush that things started to go wrong. Margaret, seizing a moment when Emma went to the bathroom, stealthily approached the dishes awaiting to be served. With quick and precise movements, she added excessive amounts of salt to some, pepper to others. Her nimble fingers worked with the efficiency of someone already practiced in culinary sabotage. The smile on her face grew with each dish she adulterated, imagining the chaos she was about to create. The results didn't take long to appear. "This sauce is inedible," complained a corpulent customer, pushing the plate away with a look of disgust. "Too salty, impossible to eat." Soon other complaints began to emerge, increasingly frequent and intense. The complaints of dissatisfied customers spread through the dining room like fire in dry straw. Walter, aghast, watched his brief chance of recovery slip through his fingers. Margaret, by his side, whispered venomously, "See, she's destroying our reputation. I warned you we couldn't trust a beggar." Emma didn't understand what was happening. Every dish that left her hands was prepared with the same care and love she had learned from her parents. The recipes were engraved in her memory as if they were something natural from her culinary knowledge and gift. But when the plates came back practically untouched, her heart tightened painfully. "There's something wrong," she muttered to Yolanda, her hands trembling as she prepared another dish. "I'm following the recipes exactly as Mom taught me." I don't understand what's happening. Walter, pressed by the growing complaints and the disapproving looks of the customers, began to question his decision. The weight of responsibility and the fear of failure began to weigh down his shoulders. Maybe Margaret is right, he said, running his hands through his graying hair in a gesture of frustration. Maybe it was hasty to entrust our kitchen to a, well, you know, we can't risk losing the few customers we have left. His words, though not said directly to Emma, reached her ears like well-aimed stabs. Margaret seized her husband's moment of doubt to tighten the siege. Throughout the afternoon, she continued her subtle sabotage, now adding slightly spoiled ingredients to the dishes. The delicious aroma of the kitchen was beginning to be replaced by unpleasant notes that the more sensitive customers were already noticing. Her satisfaction grew with each new, dissatisfied customer. Yolanda, who knew every inch of that kitchen like the back of her hand, began to notice small changes in the ingredients, misplaced seasonings, swapped herbs, altered proportions. Her years of experience shouted that something wasn't right. With a determined look, she decided to stay late after everyone had gone. Her loyalty to Grace Parker's memory required her to discover the truth. Night had already fallen when Yolanda, hidden behind one of the large pantry shelves, saw Margaret slip stealthily into the kitchen. The dim light of the industrial refrigerator partially illuminated her face, revealing an expression of pure malice that few had witnessed. The mistress, thinking she was alone, headed straight for the ingredient shelves. With a malicious smile, she began switching expiration date labels on fresh products and mixing spoiled ingredients with good ones. "Let's see how this unruly rat's culinary genius fares tomorrow, little Parker," Margaret murmured to herself as she manipulated the food. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. "When everyone finds out you're serving spoiled food, not even Walter will be able to defend you. It will be the end of your brief career as a chef." What she didn't notice was the faint light of Yolanda's cell phone recording every move of her deliberate sabotage. In the dim light of the kitchen, the definitive proof of Margaret's cruelty was finally being revealed. Hours later, Emma wiped away her tears as she packed her small bundle of clothes in the back room. The disastrous day in the kitchen had been the last straw, the customer complaints, Walter's look of disappointment, Margaret's victorious smile. She knew something was wrong with the dishes, but how to prove it? Her hands trembled as she folded the borrowed dress, now clean after so much hard work. The recent events played like a movie in her mind. The ruined dishes, the malicious comments, Walter's confidence unraveling like sugar in hot water. "Maybe it's better to go back to the streets," she murmured to herself. "At least there no one doubted my cooking skills." The full moon partially illuminated the room through the small window, casting unsettling shadows on the peeling walls. The distant aroma of the kitchen still hung in the air, mingling with the musty smell of the back room. As she organized her meager belongings, Emma found the old apron that had belonged to her mother, hidden at the bottom of the drawer. The worn fabric still carried a faint scent of spices, bringing painful memories of happier days. The stains of seasoning told stories of memorable recipes, of laughter in the kitchen, of a life that seemed increasingly distant. She clutched the apron to her chest, feeling as if her mother could somehow guide her through this difficult moment. "Forgive me, Mom," she whispered between sobs. "I'm not strong enough to stay here." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her heart race. The sound of Margaret's heels was unmistakable, echoing menacingly through the empty corridor. Quickly, she tried to hide the bundle under the bed, but it was too late. Margaret burst into the room like a storm, her eyes gleaming with malice in the moonlight. Her expensive perfume invaded the space, contrasting with the room's simplicity. "So the little rat is thinking of running away." Her voice cut through the night silence like a razor. "After all our effort to civilize her?" Her cruel smile grew as she saw the fear in Emma's eyes. With calculated movements, Margaret closed the door behind her, turning the key in the lock with a threatening click. The metallic sound echoed through the small room like a prison sentence. Her heels marked each step towards Emma, like a metronome announcing the arrival of danger. "You know, dear, I've been watching you. Your little attempts to sabotage my restaurant, blaming the ingredients, so predictable." Each word was laced with venom, as she approached Emma like a predator cornering its prey. "But I didn't do any of that," protested Emma, backing up until she was pressed against the cold wall. Her eyes searched desperately for an escape route, but the room seemed to be shrinking. "Someone is altering my recipes, I know they are." Margaret laughed, a cold and humorless sound that made Emma tremble to her bones. No one will believe a skinny beggar against the word of the respectable Mrs. Collins. Do you know what happens to troublesome girls like you? There are places, institutions that know how to deal with little liars. The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning every inch of the environment. Margaret began to ransack the room with growing fury, rummaging through the drawers and scattering Emma's few belongings across the floor. Each object thrown was like a small stab in the girl's heart. "Oh, how touching," she mocked, picking up the apron with her perfectly manicured nails. Still clinging to those pathetic memories. "Maybe I should burn this too, like I did with that recipe book." Her words struck Emma like a punch to the stomach. In the rush to turn everything over, Margaret knocked over an old dresser with excessive force, causing it to scrape against the wall. The heavy piece of furniture, as it moved, revealed a small gap in the baseboard, from which a few yellowed papers fell. The sound of the documents sliding across the floor seemed deafening in the tense silence of the room. Emma, still leaning against the wall, watched the papers scatter like dry leaves in the wind. Margaret froze when she saw the pages, her face losing all color beneath the expensive makeup. "Don't you dare touch that," Margaret hissed, her voice trembling with contained rage, but it was too late. Emma had already reached for one of the papers with her nimble hands. Her eyes widened as she recognized the letterhead of her parents' old restaurant on the document. It was a series of contracts and receipts, all signed by Margaret, dated weeks before the accident that killed her parents. "Impossible," Emma muttered, her hands trembling as she held the evidence that began to reveal a dark truth. Margaret advanced like a snake about to strike, but Emma was faster, her reflexes sharpened by years on the streets. She grabbed the documents and ran to the farthest corner of the room, her heart pounding so hard it seemed like it wanted to escape from her chest. You knew my parents. You worked at their restaurant." The words came out choppy from the shocking discovery. Margaret remained standing in the middle of the room, her face a mask of contained fury, her fists clenched at her sides. "Give me those papers now, you nosy little pest," Margaret ordered, her voice wavering between anger and fear, "or I'll make sure you never see daylight again." But Emma barely heard the threats, her eyes racing over the yellowed pages, absorbing every revealing detail. On the last document, something made her blood run cold. A sabotage contract, promising Margaret a considerable sum of money in exchange for the destruction of Parker's restaurant. And further down, a handwritten note about arranged accidents that made the whole puzzle fit together in her horrified mind. The truth about her parents' death was beginning to take a terrible shape before her eyes. The next morning, taking advantage of Margaret's departure to handle banking matters, Emma slipped into the restaurant's office. The documents found the night before had awakened a suspicion that wouldn't let her sleep. With trembling hands, she began to rummage through the drawers of Margaret's desk, her heart racing at every creak of the old building. The office, normally so organized and immaculate, harbored obscure secrets in its locked drawers. Behind a stack of seemingly unimportant papers, she found a carefully hidden red folder. The synthetic leather was worn at the edges, indicating frequent handling. Inside, a disturbing revelation. Dozens of consulting contracts with different traditional New Orleans restaurants all followed a sinister pattern. After hiring Margaret as a consultant, the establishments would start experiencing mysterious problems and eventually go bankrupt. It was a meticulously documented trail of destruction. In a subfolder marked Specials, Emma discovered old photographs of her parents alongside Margaret. The time-yellowed images showed apparently happy moments at the Parker's restaurant. The woman's smile in the photos was the same one she now used with Walter, sweet on the surface but with a calculating glint in her eyes. Attached to the photos were receipts for large sums received from competing companies, all dated around the time of the bankruptcies. "So this is how she does it," Emma muttered. "She destroys the restaurants from the inside so others can buy them cheap." A noise in the hallway made her jump. The old building creaked and cracked, making it impossible to distinguish normal sounds from actual footsteps. Quickly, she tried to reorganize the papers, but in her haste, she knocked over a picture frame. The glass shattered on the floor, revealing behind the official photo a notation with dates and figures. The complete schedule of the Collins restaurant sabotage. Not this one, Emma thought, her hands trembling as she tried to clean up the mess. The shards of glass reflecting the morning light like tiny daggers on the floor. Margaret entered the office like a hurricane, the sound of her heels echoing menacingly on the wooden floor. Her eyes immediately registered the scene: open drawers, scattered papers, and Emma kneeling amidst shards of glass. Fury transformed her face into a frightening mask. "You meddling little pest," she hissed, slamming the door shut. "I thought after last night you had learned not to poke your nose where it doesn't belong." Fear paralyzed Emma for a moment, but the anger at discovering the truth about her parents gave her courage. Years of survival on the streets had taught her to face her fears. "I know what you did," she shouted, holding the documents like a shield. "You destroyed my parents' restaurant, and now you're doing the same to Walter. You're a professional saboteur." Margaret advanced, her red nails like claws ready to strike. "No one will believe you," Margaret replied with a cruel smile, snatching the papers from Emma's hands. "You know why? Because accidents happen all the time in kitchens, especially with little thieves who don't know their place." Her fingers closed around Emma's arm with enough force to almost leave marks, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the delicate skin. Dragging the girl into the kitchen, Margaret began to heat a branding iron, the kind used to leave the restaurant's logo on special cuts. "You know, dear, sometimes we need to teach more. Permanent lessons." The metal began to turn red over the fire as Emma struggled to break free. The metallic smell of the heated iron mingled with her own fear. "How about a little mark to remind you not to mess with other people's things?" Yolanda, who had just arrived to start her shift, heard the muffled screams coming from the kitchen. Years of working at that restaurant had never prepared her for such a disturbing scene. Her heart froze when she saw Margaret holding the red-hot iron, dangerously close to Emma's exposed arm. The girl was pinned against the counter, tears of terror streaming down her ash-stained face. Walter was in his office, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding in the kitchen. The sound of the old fan and the noise of traffic on the street muffled the sounds of the struggle. Margaret had made sure he was busy with important paperwork, ensuring no one would interfere with her educational moment with Emma. "After this," she thought, "that little pest will never dare defy me again." The smell of heated metal filled the kitchen, mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The hanging pots reflected the grotesque scene like distorted mirrors. Margaret slowly brought the iron closer to Emma's arm, savoring the moment like a predator toying with its prey. "I'll give you one last chance to swear you'll never touch my documents again," she whispered, her face twisted into an expression of cruel pleasure. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the heat of the iron getting closer to her skin. In her mind, memories of her parents' accident mixed with the present moment. The fear and imminent pain made her body tremble uncontrollably. "Mom, Dad, forgive me," she thought. "I wasn't strong enough to expose the truth." The scream of pain never came. At the last second, Yolanda appeared like a bolt of lightning, pushing Margaret with all the strength accumulated from years of hard work in the kitchen. The iron fell to the floor with a metallic clang, leaving a dark mark on the ceramic tiles. Sparks flew as the superheated metal struck the ground. "Don't you dare touch her!" the employee shouted, placing herself between Emma and Margaret like a human shield. Margaret regained her balance, leaning against the kitchen counter. Her face, usually so controlled, was a mask of absolute fury. "You just made a big mistake, Yolanda," she said, her voice trembling with contained rage. "A mistake that will cost you your job, and much more." But before she could continue her threat, she noticed something in Yolanda's hands that made her blood run cold. A cell phone still recording, capturing every second of that horrific scene. "I think the one who made a mistake was you," Yolanda replied, keeping Emma protected behind her. "Now we have proof not only of the sabotage at the restaurant, but also of your educational techniques." The sound of Walter's footsteps in the hallway announced that the situation was about to gain a new witness, and Margaret's face lost all color as she realized her mask of perfection was about to fall. 3 in the morning. The silence on the streets of New Orleans was broken only by the distant barking of dogs and the occasional rumble of truck engines. Emma silently slid through the back room window, her small bundle of belongings firmly tied to her back. The red mark on her arm, where the hot iron had almost touched her, still burned like a constant reminder of the danger she faced. Even with Yolanda trying to protect her, Margaret's threat loomed like a deadly shadow over her head. The dark streets brought back memories of her life before the Collins restaurant. Every alley, every shadow represented both refuge and danger. The cold, early morning air seemed sharper now that she was alone again. Her bare feet moved silently across the still warm asphalt from the previous day, while her mind replayed the events of the past few weeks. The dream of a better life was turning into an ever-deepening nightmare. The municipal market would be her first destination. The first vendors would soon arrive to set up their stalls, simple people who might be able to give her temporary shelter. Her hands gripped the small envelope with the evidence against Margaret. The documents she had managed to hide during the chaos in the kitchen. The papers seemed to burn inside her clothes, weighed down with the burden of so many lives destroyed by Margaret's ambition. As she turned a corner, her heart froze. The unmistakable sound of high heels echoed off the walls of the old buildings, multiplying like an ominous omen. Margaret emerged from the shadows like a macabre apparition, her pale face standing out in the dim light from the street lamps. The woman's eyes shone with cruel satisfaction, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Did you really think you could escape so easily, dear?" Her voice cut through the early morning silence like a razor. "After all the work I went through to keep you under control?" Margaret approached slowly, each step of her heels marking the closing distance between them, the sound echoing off the walls like a macabre metronome. Emma tried to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground by terror. Years on the streets had taught her to fight or flee, but something about Margaret's presence paralyzed her completely. The woman drew even closer, her expensive perfume mingling with the cold morning air, creating a suffocating atmosphere. "You know, I've been thinking," Margaret continued, circling Emma like a snake about to strike. "Perhaps I've been too kind to you so far, but don't worry, I have something special prepared." Her hand dipped into the pocket of her expensive coat, retrieving a yellowed envelope. The brightness in Margaret's eyes made Emma tremble even more. The woman waved the envelope like a trump card, savoring every moment of tension. "Do you know the story of how Walter lost his first wife? The official version is very convenient. But the truth? The truth would destroy not only him, but the entire Collins family legacy." The words hit Emma like a punch in the stomach. Margaret continued, each word dripping with venom. "Just imagine the scandal when I reveal that the Honorable Walter is not so honorable after all. And you know who everyone will blame for the revelation? The little beggar he naively took in. After all, who would believe a well-off person like me against a filthy street thief?" Heavy footsteps interrupted Margaret's threat. Yolanda appeared running, panting, her face marked by concern. "Emma, thank God I found you." The maid placed herself between the two, but Margaret only laughed, a cold and humorless sound that echoed through the empty street. Ah, how touching! The faithful maid coming to the rescue. Margaret took out her cell phone from her pocket, her fingers dancing on the screen with calculated precision. "Walter, excuse me for waking you, dear, but we need to talk about Yolanda. I just caught her helping Emma steal money from the cash register." Her voice took on a tone of false concern that made Emma's stomach churn. Walter arrived minutes later, still tying his robe over his pajamas, his graying hair disheveled by the rush. His usually kind face was twisted with disappointment as Margaret presented her carefully planted evidence. Counterfeit bills in Yolanda's purse, a forged confession, bought witnesses. The web of lies was so well woven that even Yolanda's genuine tears seemed to confirm her guilt. "After 15 years, Yolanda, how could you?" Walter's voice was heavy with sadness and disappointment. The maid's desperate explanations fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the sound of the awakening city. "You're fired," he finally sentenced, each word seeming to cost him an immense effort. Emma watched the scene in horror, her body trembling with rage and helplessness. She tried to speak, to defend Yolanda, but Margaret silenced her with a look that promised even worse consequences. "Walter, dear, I think we should call the police," she suggested with false sweetness, her fingers discreetly gripping Emma's arm hard enough to leave marks. Yolanda, with tears streaming down her wrinkled face, began to walk away. Before leaving, she managed to whisper to Emma, "Be strong, little one, the truth always prevails." Her words were almost lost in the early morning breeze, but they carried the weight of a promise that made Emma's heart ache even more. Walter returned home crestfallen, leaving Margaret to sort out the details. As soon as they were alone, she turned to Emma with a victorious smile that transformed her beautiful face into a mask of cruelty. "See what happens to those who try to defy me. Now let's go back home, we have much to discuss." As she was dragged back to the restaurant, Emma felt the weight of the hidden documents in her clothes. The evidence against Margaret was still with her, as was the guilt of not being able to defend Yolanda. "Forgive me," she thought, as the first lights of dawn began to tint the New Orleans sky with shades of grace and orange that seemed to mock her misery. Margaret pushed Emma inside the restaurant, locking the door with a threatening click that echoed through the empty hall. "Now, dear, let's discuss your future, or lack thereof." But before she could continue, a message arrived on her cell phone, making her face pale. It was an old photo showing Margaret next to the Parkers' car moments before the fatal accident. The sender was unknown, but the message was clear. The truth always finds its way. During the day, the sounds from the restaurant above were a constant torture. The dragging of chairs, the clinking of cutlery, the laughter of customers, every sound was a cruel reminder of the world beyond those stone walls. The aroma of food being prepared drifted down through the cracks in the floorboards, making your stomach growl painfully. Margaret appeared occasionally to check on her prisoner, each visit accompanied by a new psychological torment. The isolation began to weigh on Emma's mind like a lead blanket. The walls seemed to move in the darkness, inching closer each time the lamp flickered. The rats became her only constant companions, some even beginning to approach without fear, as if they recognized her as a fellow captive. In her darkest moments, she found herself conversing with them, giving them names, sharing stories of her former life. One morning, or was it evening, time had lost all meaning in the basement, and different voices penetrated through the ceiling. Emma dragged herself to the door, pressing her ear against the damp wood. Margaret was showing the restaurant to someone, her sugary voice describing the wonderful possibilities of the establishment. "The current owner is out of town," she explained, "but I can assure you he is more than willing to sell for the right price." The sound of footsteps above her changed direction, moving closer to the area over the basement. Emma could distinguish multiple male voices, all deep and professional, discussing values and conditions. One name in particular caught her attention: Ramirez. It was the same last name as the man who had bought the restaurant from her parents after the accident. Her heart froze with the revelation. "As you can see, gentlemen," Margaret's voice came clear through the floorboards, "the restaurant has immense potential. It just needs some strategic changes." The tone in her voice was the same that Emma remembered hearing in her most painful memories, when as a child she would hide under the desk in her parents' office and overhear conversations that were only now beginning to make sense. The footsteps continued echoing above, and through the cracks in the ceiling, Emma could see shadows moving. Dust dislodged from the ancient beams with each heavier stride, falling onto her upturned face. In her dark hideaway, she clutched the incriminating documents to her chest, trembling not with fear but with a growing rage. The same group that had destroyed her family was about to do it all over again, and she was the only witness, trapped and powerless in the bowels of the restaurant. The next day, Walter returned from his trip the night before, and now sat at one of the tables in the main dining area, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the decision Margaret was pressuring him to make. The restaurant was still empty, the chairs carefully arranged like a silent audience to the unfolding drama. "Dear," Margaret's voice was soft as poisoned velvet, "you know we have no choice. The debts keep mounting, and these buyers are offering more than a fair price." Emma, who had finally been released from the basement but forbidden to approach the kitchen, watched the scene hidden behind a column. Her body still trembled from the night spent with the rats, but her eyes held a determined gleam. Margaret had warned her. Any attempt to tell Walter about the basement would result in even worse consequences. "Besides," she whispered with a cruel smile, "who would believe a penniless beggar over the word of the respectable Mrs. Collins?" Margaret presented carefully manipulated spreadsheets and documents, showing a financial situation even worse than reality. "Look, Walter, we're drowning in debt. In a few months, we won't even be able to pay the staff. And now with all these problems in the kitchen." Her cutting gaze fell on Emma, who instinctively shrank further into the shadows. Walter ran his hands through his graying hair, a gesture that betrayed his anguish. The restaurant was more than a business. It was his family's legacy, the dream of his first wife. But Margaret was right about the recent issues: dissatisfied customers, ruined dishes, constant complaints. "Perhaps," he said in a weary voice, "perhaps it is time to face reality." At that moment, a movement by the back door caught Emma's attention. Yolanda, who had been unjustly fired, slipped silently into the restaurant. The former employee made a discreet gesture for Emma to follow her to the pantry. "Little one," she whispered, "I've uncovered something you need to see." Meanwhile, in the main dining area, Margaret continued her performance. "The buyers want to keep some of the staff," she explained, her melodious voice hiding her true intentions. "Of course, we'll have to make some changes to the team, starting with that girl who has only caused us problems." Walter nodded absently, his spirit already broken by the prospect of losing the restaurant. In the pantry, Yolanda showed Emma a set of documents she had managed to gather. "I've been investigating your employer for weeks," she explained in a low voice. "It wasn't hard to uncover the pattern. She's been doing this for years, destroying traditional restaurants so larger companies can buy them for dirt cheap." The sound of Margaret's heels approaching made the two freeze. Quickly, Yolanda pushed Emma behind some stacked boxes, just in time for Margaret to enter the pantry. The woman appeared to be looking for something specific, rummaging through drawers and shelves with barely concealed urgency. From her hiding spot, Emma watched as Margaret retrieved an envelope from a secret location behind a loose shelf. The dim pantry light partially illuminated its contents. They appeared to be old photographs. One of them fell to the floor, and Emma's heart nearly stopped. It was an image of her parents' car, moments before the accident. Margaret did not notice the fallen picture as she hurried out of the pantry. As soon as the sound of her footsteps faded away, Emma ran to pick up the photograph. On the back, there was a note with a date, time, and a cash amount. But the most shocking thing was the list of names that followed, a series of traditional restaurants that had mysteriously gone bankrupt in recent years. Yolanda and Emma were examining the discovery when excited voices came from the dining room. "It's settled then," Margaret announced triumphantly. "We'll sign the papers tomorrow." Walter's voice, choked with emotion, merely murmured a defeated agreement. Emma's heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Margaret was not just a saboteur. She was a professional destroyer of traditional restaurants, and the Collins would be her next victim. But when Emma turned the photo to show Yolanda her discovery, something even more disturbing caught her eye. In the corner of the image, partially visible, was Margaret standing next to her parents' car, and in her hand, a greasy wrench. "My God," Yolanda whispered, her voice trembling. "She didn't just buy the accident. She caused it herself." Emma barely had time to process the revelation when she heard Margaret calling her name. It was time for dinner, and the woman wanted to ensure her prisoner was well away from the kitchen, while the buyers finalized their inspection of the restaurant. In the pocket of her apron, the newly discovered documents weighed like lead. Emma now knew not only about the plan to destroy the Collins restaurant, but also had concrete evidence of Margaret's direct involvement in her parents' deaths. The question was, how to use this information before it was too late. The old office of the Collins restaurant was shrouded in the dusk of early evening when Emma and Yolanda slipped inside. The smell of old papers and waxed wood filled the space, mingling with the distant aroma of the kitchen. Margaret was occupied in the main dining room, planning the special dinner where the sale would be officiated, leaving a small window of opportunity for the two to investigate. With quick and silent movements, they began rummaging through the drawers of the large mahogany desk, every noise making their hearts race. "The documents I found in the basement are just part of it," Emma whispered, her hands still trembling from the night spent with the rats. "There has to be more evidence here." Yolanda, using years of experience at the restaurant, knew exactly where to look. Her knowledge of Margaret's habits was their greatest advantage at this moment. Behind an apparently ordinary painting depicting the old facade of the restaurant, she found a small hidden safe. "Margaret always looked at this painting when she was nervous," she explained, her skilled fingers trying different combinations. "I noticed she changed something here every time she closed a special deal. A woman like her always keeps her most important secrets well guarded." The soft click of the lock sounding was like music to their ears. The safe door swung open, revealing organized stacks of documents, each one representing a destroyed restaurant, a ruined family, a shattered dream. Emma held her breath as Yolanda began removing the folders, carefully placing them on the desk. The moonlight streaming through the office window partially illuminated the papers, as if the night itself wanted to reveal those dark secrets. Within the safe, one revelation after another emerged. Contracts, photos, receipts, a complete history of Margaret's criminal career. It wasn't just isolated restaurants. It was a systematic operation involving a network of corrupt businessmen. Every traditional establishment that had failed in recent years bore Margaret's mark. First, she would infiltrate as a consultant or the owner's wife, then methodically begin the sabotage. "Look at this," Emma murmured, her hands trembling as she held a specific document. She received a percentage of every restaurant she helped destroy, 20% of the final sale value. The biggest discovery, however, was at the bottom of the safe in a red folder marked Special Parker, a complete dossier on Emma's parents' restaurant. Photos from the accident scene showed the wrecked car from different angles. Doctored mechanical reports indicated brake failure, but attached receipts showed payments to a mechanic for sabotaging the vehicle. Most shocking were the printed emails between Margaret and the buyers, planning every detail of the tragedy. It wasn't an accident. Emma felt her legs weaken, needing to lean on the desk. She planned it all from the beginning, even the accident that took my parents. The sound of heels in the hallway made the two freeze. Margaret was on the phone, her animated voice echoing through the walls. "Yes, tomorrow's dinner will be perfect for closing the deal. Walter doesn't even suspect the buyers are the same ones who—" "No, don't worry, that little meddler won't interfere. I have special plans for her after the sale is concluded." The sound faded as she walked away, but her words left a chill in Emma's stomach. Among the documents scattered across the table, they found an unsigned contract dated for the following day. It was an agreement to sell the Collins restaurant for less than half its actual value, with a specific clause about removing undesired elements from the staff roster. At the bottom, a handwritten note detailed a plan for accidents to happen after the transfer of ownership. "She's not just planning to sell the restaurant," Yolanda whispered, her face pale with horror. "She wants to get rid of you the same way she did with your parents." The sound of several voices approaching the office made the two women's blood run cold. Margaret was returning, and she wasn't alone. The deep tone of male voices indicated that the buyers were with her, probably to verify some documentation. Emma and Yolanda frantically began hiding the evidence in their clothes, trying to leave everything exactly as they had found it. The safe was closed with trembling hands, the painting put back in its original position, but there were still papers scattered across the table when the footsteps reached the door. "And here is the office where we'll keep the contracts for tomorrow." Margaret's voice sounded closer and closer, the sound of her heels marking a countdown to disaster. Yolanda pushed Emma behind an old filing cabinet, but there wasn't enough time for her to hide herself. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was sure everyone would hear it. "I just need to grab some folders and—" The door opened, and Margaret froze upon seeing her former employee standing in the middle of her private office. Margaret's eyes quickly scanned the scene like radar, the papers on the table, the slightly crooked painting. Yolanda alone in the office after hours. Her well-made-up face transformed into a mask of controlled fury, her red lips contracting into a dangerous smile. "Well, well," her voice cut the air like a blade. "It seems someone didn't learn their lesson about sticking their nose where it doesn't belong." Behind the filing cabinet, Emma held her breath, the incriminating documents weighing in her pockets like lead. Margaret closed the door with a soft but menacing click, her movements reminiscent of a snake about to strike. "You know, Yolanda," she said, her voice now dangerously sweet, "I was wondering how that little pest was managing to find out so many things. Now it all makes sense." Her heels marked each step towards the former employee, while the buyers watched from the doorway with morbid interest. One of them, the same man Emma recognized as being involved in her parents' deaths, smiled cruelly, anticipating what was to come. "I think we need to have a serious talk about loyalty and consequences." It was the middle of the night when Emma snuck into the kitchen of Collins' restaurant. After the discovery of the documents and the confrontation with Margaret in the office, she knew this would be her last chance. The sale dinner was scheduled for that night, and she needed to act. Her hands trembled as she lit the stoves, but her heart was determined. "I'll prepare Mom's special menu," she thought, "and everyone will know the truth about the Parkers." Margaret had spent the previous day planning every detail of the dinner with a team of hired chefs, specifically for the occasion. Emma had overheard her instructing them to prepare elaborate dishes, but soulless expensive food that would impress the buyers but lacked the tradition that had made the restaurant famous. Now, alone in the silent kitchen, Emma began to secretly prepare the real dishes that would be served. Walter was in his office, flipping through old photos of the restaurant in its glory days. The hesitation grew in his chest as the moment of the sale approached. "It's my family's legacy," he muttered to himself, running his fingers over an old photo where his first wife smiled beside him. "How can I just hand it all over?" In her private suite, Margaret was making the final adjustments to her plan. On the bed, forged documents showed much larger losses than reality, convincing Walter that the sale was inevitable. In the bathroom, a small vial awaited something to calm her husband during dinner, ensuring he wouldn't change his mind at the last minute. "Tonight, it will all be over," she smiled at her reflection in the mirror. In the kitchen, Emma worked feverishly. The aroma of the Parkers' secret spices began to fill the air, each dish a declaration of war against Margaret's lies. Her small hands moved with precision between pots and seasonings, replicating the recipes her mother had taught her with so much love. "This will be my revenge," she thought, served with every bite. Yolanda had recovered from the confrontation in the office and was now discreetly helping Emma, diverting the attention of the hired chefs while the girl prepared her special dishes. "Be careful, little one," she whispered as she passed. "Margaret is more dangerous than ever. I overheard her talking about her plans for tonight. It's not just the contracts she wants to finalize." Walter went down to the kitchen, drawn by the familiar aromas he hadn't smelled in years. Something about those scents transported him to happier times, making his heart ache even more at the idea of the sale. Standing at the door, he observed the frantic preparations, his resolve beginning to waver. "Maybe there's still a chance," he muttered to himself. "Maybe we can still save this place." Margaret noticed the change in her husband's behavior and accelerated her plans. With determined steps, she headed to the kitchen for a surprise inspection. Her face contorted with fury as she smelled the characteristic Parker aromas. "Who authorized these recipes?" Her voice cut the air like a razor. The hired chefs looked at each other, confused. Emma tried to hide among the ovens, but it was too late. Margaret located her immediately, her eyes shining with murderous fury. "You!" she hissed, advancing like a snake about to strike. "I thought I made it clear you were forbidden from entering the kitchen." Her red nails dug into Emma's arm, dragging her away from the stoves. The noise in the kitchen drew Walter's attention, and he began to approach to see what was happening. Margaret needed to act quickly. With a fake smile, she announced loudly, "Darling, I need you to help me check some ingredients in the walk-in." Immediately. Her tone left no room for discussion. Emma knew it was a trap, but she had no choice. If she resisted, Margaret would reveal her attempted sabotage to Walter, destroying any chance of exposing the truth during dinner. With reluctant steps, she followed Margaret to the huge metal door of the walk-in freezer. "I just need to grab some things," Margaret lied sweetly, pushing Emma inside. The intense cold hit Emma like a punch, but before she could react, she heard the metallic click of the door closing. Margaret laughed from the other side of the thick door. "Enjoy your stay, dear. By the time they finish searching for you, we'll have sold this place and left. Maybe they'll find a melted rat popsicle. Or maybe not." The panic began to take hold of Emma as the cold penetrated her bones. The cold room was large enough to store supplies for an entire month, its metal walls reflecting the faint glow of the single lamp on the ceiling. The temperature kept dropping, and her teeth were already starting to chatter. "Someone will find me," she thought desperately. "Someone has to notice." But deep down she knew that Margaret had chosen the perfect moment. With all the chaos of the dinner preparations, no one would notice her absence until it was too late. Margaret walked away from the cold room with a satisfied smile, adjusting her perfectly arranged hair. Soon, little Parker will have the same fate as her parents," she thought, returning to oversee the dinner preparations. The muffled sound of Emma's fists pounding against the metal door was music to her ears. gradually diminishing as she walked away. The main hall of Colin's restaurant shone under the light of crystal chandeliers. Margaret had spared no effort in decorating for the sale dinner, transforming the ambience into a setting worthy of her great victory. The first guests began to arrive, businessmen in expensive suits and their wives in designer dresses. At the center of it all, Margaret circulated like a queen in her realm, her red dress drawing attention as much as her triumphant smile. Yolanda observed everything from the kitchen door, her heart tight with worry. It had been hours since she'd seen Emma, and Margaret's satisfied smile only increased her suspicions. She began to search discreetly all over the kitchen until she heard a muffled sound coming from the cold room. Her blood ran cold as she realized what Margaret had done. Running to the metal door, Yolanda could hear Emma's faint knocks from the other side. The lock was complex, but years of working at the restaurant had given her knowledge of all its secrets. With trembling hands, she began to manipulate the mechanism. "Hold on, little one," she whispered as she worked. "I'll get you out of there." When the door finally opened, Emma was huddled in a corner, her lips blue from the cold. Yolanda quickly wrapped her in her own coat, rubbing her arms to restore circulation. "The documents," Emma murmured between chattering teeth. I need to get them before the dinner." In the hall, Margaret savored every moment of her impending victory. Walter was seated in a corner, a half-empty glass of wine in his hands, his face marked by resignation. The buyers, the same ones who had destroyed the Parkers' restaurant, chatted animatedly about their plans to modernize the establishment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret's voice rang clear through the hall, "in a few moments we will serve the dinner that will mark the beginning of a new era for this restaurant." Her smile was radiant as she raised her glass of champagne. "Walter and I are thrilled to pass this legacy into such capable hands." In the back of the kitchen, Yolanda helped Emma recover, serving her hot tea while they planned their next move. "Margaret hid all the dishes you prepared," Yolanda explained. "She realized they were your parents' recipes." Emma nodded, a determined gleam replacing the fear in her eyes. "It doesn't matter. I have something much more important to serve tonight." The waiters began to circulate with the first appetizers, elaborate but soulless dishes chosen by Margaret to impress the buyers. Walter tasted each one mechanically, his palate registering the absence of the love and tradition that had once made the restaurant famous. "This is how Grace used to make it," he murmured to himself, remembering his first wife. Margaret watched every detail with hawk-like eyes, making sure nothing could interfere with her plans. Occasionally, she would cast satisfied glances toward the kitchen, savoring her triumph over little Parker. In a few minutes, the contracts would be signed, and she would finally complete her revenge against the family that had once rejected her. The moment of signing approached. Margaret signaled the waiters to bring more champagne, while the buyers prepared their pens. Walter rose slowly, like a man walking to his own execution. The murmur of conversation died down. All eyes turned to the main table. Before we proceed," Margaret began, her honeyed voice concealing the cruelty of her intentions, "I would like to make a special toast to the memory of New Orleans' great restaurants, and to those who knew when it was time to leave." Her cruel smile met the complicit gazes of the buyers. It was at this moment that the main doors of the hall burst open with a bang. Emma stood in the entrance, still pale from the cold of the refrigerator, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made Margaret freeze with the glass halfway to her lips. In her hands, a familiar red folder, the same one containing all the evidence of Margaret's crimes. "I think the guests would like to know tonight's true menu," said Emma, her young but firm voice echoing through the silent hall. An appetizer of conspiracy, followed by a main course of murder, and for dessert, all the evidence of Margaret Hayes's crimes. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret let her glass fall, the sound of shattering crystal on the floor marking the beginning of the end of her reign of terror. Walter stood up, his eyes alternating between the girl who so resembled Grace Parker and his current wife, whose mask of perfection began to crumble. "What is this beggar talking about?" Margaret tried to regain control of the situation, her voice trembling slightly. "Walter dear, this girl is clearly disturbed. Guards!" But Yolanda had already strategically positioned herself at the door, preventing the guards from entering. Emma began to walk slowly across the ballroom, her steps echoing in the tense silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present the true menu for tonight," her voice gaining strength with each word. Opening the folder, she began distributing copies of the documents at each table. Here we have records of every restaurant Margaret destroyed, including... She paused dramatically, her eyes fixed on the buyers. The Parker restaurant owned by my parents. The guests began to murmur as they examined the papers. Photos, contracts, receipts, each document revealing a new layer of Margaret's web of lies. Walter picked up one of the photos with trembling hands. It was Margaret, years younger, standing next to the Parker's car, moments before the accident. This is ridiculous. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but her face was growing paler. Walter, you're not going to believe these forgeries, are you? This girl is trying to ruin our only chance to save the restaurant. Her eyes desperately sought support among the buyers, who were beginning to discreetly back away. Emma continued, Mrs. Hayes has a very specific method. First, she approaches struggling traditional restaurants. Then she sabotages the operations from within until the owners are forced to sell. And when sabotage isn't enough, she raised the photo of the car and said, accidents also happen. Walter's face transformed as understanding hit him. All the little inconsistencies of the past few months, the inexplicable changes in food quality, the dissatisfied customers, it all started to make sense. Margaret, his voice was only a horrified whisper, what have you done? What have I done? Margaret finally lost control, her mask of elegance shattering completely. I built an empire. Those foolish romantics like the Parkers, like you, Walter, thinking restaurants are about tradition and love for cuisine, you deserved to fail. I merely accelerated the process. The buyers, realizing the plan had collapsed, were trying to discreetly make their way to the exit. But Yolanda, with a surprising agility for her age, had already alerted the police. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. And you, Margaret turned to Emma, her eyes flashing with hatred. You should have died in that walk-in cooler, just like your parents in that car. The entire ballroom gasped at the involuntary confession. Walter staggered, needing to lean on a chair. At that moment, the police officers entered the ballroom. Margaret looked around like a cornered animal, searching for an escape route. But it was too late. Years of carefully planned crimes were laid out on the tables of the restaurant, along with the untouched plates of her last victory dinner. As the officers handcuffed Margaret, Emma approached Walter. I'm sorry you had to find out the truth this way, she said gently. But you deserved to know. This restaurant deserved a chance to survive with dignity. The old restaurant owner looked at the girl, seeing in her not only the daughter of the Parkers, but also the hope of redemption for his beloved restaurant. You have your mother's talent, he finally said, and your father's courage. His words were interrupted by the sound of applause, the guests, still in shock from the revelations, beginning to show their support for the young chef. Margaret, as she was led away by the police, cast one last venomous look at Emma. This isn't over, little Parker, she hissed. You have no idea how far I can. But her words were cut off as the restaurant doors closed behind her, marking the end of her reign of terror in New Orleans gastronomy. Walter rose, his posture regaining something of his former dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, I think we need a new menu for tonight. Emma, do you think you could honor us with some traditional Parker recipes? The girl's smile was her answer, while Yolanda was already starting to organize the kitchen for a true celebration. At the moment the police officers tried to handcuff Margaret, she managed to break free with a quick and precise movement. Chaos ensued in the main hall of the Collins restaurant when she pushed one of the waiters, causing a perfect distraction. Amidst the confusion of broken glasses and surprised screams, Margaret took the opportunity to grab her purse, which contained crucial documents that could not fall into the wrong hands. Emma, still standing in the center of the hall, noticed the maneuver and continued her presentation with a louder voice, keeping everyone's attention. The buyers present here are not mere businessmen, she announced, pointing to the men who were trying to discreetly head towards the exits. They are part of a scheme that has already destroyed dozens of traditional restaurants in New Orleans. And I have proof. Walter watched the scene with growing horror, recognizing in the faces of the buyers the same men who had acquired other famous establishments in the city. Their minds traveled back to old conversations with other owners, stories of mysterious bankruptcies and inexplicable accidents. So that's how the Martinez restaurant closed, and the Toledo Cafe? All of them. His voice failed as he realized the extent of the conspiracy. Margaret took advantage of the distraction to sneak towards the kitchen, but Yolanda blocked her path. "Not so fast, Ma'am," said the former employee firmly. "I think the police will be very interested in the contents of that purse of yours." The two women stared at each other for a tense moment, years of resentment concentrated in a single look. "The documents show everything," Emma continued, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Each restaurant followed the same pattern. Margaret would approach, gain the owner's trust, and then start the sabotage. Spoiled food, dissatisfied customers, problems with suppliers, all carefully planned to force the sale. The buyers, seeing their plans crumbling, tried one last gambit. "Those are just speculations from a street girl," protested the oldest one, his face red with rage. "Walter, you're not going to believe these lies, are you?" But his words sounded empty when Emma revealed photos of them in secret meetings with Margaret. "And worst of all," Emma continued, her voice now laden with pain, "was what they did to my parents. The Parker restaurant was not only sabotaged, it was destroyed. And I have proof that the accident that killed my parents was meticulously planned." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Walter stumbled to a chair, his legs too weak to support him. "Margaret," he murmured, "you not only betrayed me, but destroyed entire families. In the name of what?" His gaze swept across the hall, resting on each face present, seeking an explanation that made sense. The police officers began to reorganize, surrounding the restaurant's exits. The buyers, realizing there was no escape, began to surrender, some already negotiating plea deals in exchange for reduced sentences. "It was all her idea," one of them shouted, pointing at Margaret. "She planned everything, we just provided the capital." Emma approached Walter, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "You were not to blame," she said softly. "Margaret deceived everyone. But now we can rebuild, make this place what it should have always been." The old restaurateur nodded slowly, silent tears streaming down his face. Margaret, seeing herself cornered, made her final move. With a quick motion, she pushed Yolanda against a table and ran towards the back exit. "You don't understand," she shouted over her shoulder. "This is bigger than all of you." Her purse, clutched against her chest, contained not only documents of the current scheme, but evidence of an even bigger conspiracy. The police officers gave chase, but Margaret knew every corridor, every secret passage in the restaurant. Her words echoed through the hall as she disappeared. "This is not over, little Parker. There is much more to be revealed." Emma made a move to follow her, but Walter held her back. "Let the police handle her," he said, his voice regaining some of its former strength. "We have a restaurant to save." But as the words left his lips, the sound of an engine starting came from the back street. Margaret had managed to reach her car, and with her went all the documents that could expose a web of corruption far greater than anyone imagined. "She can't escape with that evidence," Emma cried, running towards the exit. The sound of the engine was already fading into the distance, leaving behind a shocked hall and a story that was far from over. The sound of sirens echoed through the streets of New Orleans as police cars converged on the Collins restaurant. Emma, still panting from the frustrated pursuit of Margaret, watched as the officers established a perimeter around the establishment. Walter was sitting at one of the tables in the main hall, his face a mask of shock and betrayal, as investigators collected evidence scattered during the commotion. The glare of police camera flashes intermittently illuminated the setting, casting dancing shadows on walls that had once witnessed happier moments. "Miss Parker," called Detective Rivera, a middle-aged man with tired but attentive eyes, "I need you to tell me exactly how you uncovered this whole operation." His voice was gentle but firm as he guided Emma to a table further from the center of action. The girl nervously clutched her mother's apron, which she had recovered during the confusion. "Where do I begin?" she thought, her memories mingling with the fresh pain of the revelation about her parents' deaths. The detained buyers were taken one by one to different vehicles, each of them trying to negotiate their freedom with promises of denouncement. The eldest, whom Emma recognized from the photos as the leader of the group that had bought her parents' restaurant, seemed particularly eager to speak. "She planned it all," he shouted as he was led out. "Margaret had a list, a specific order of restaurants we should acquire. It was a bigger plan, much bigger. His words were cut off by the sound of the vehicle door slamming shut. Yolanda, with an improvised bandage on the arm where she had been pushed by Margaret, methodically organized the evidence they had managed to recover. Her experienced hands separated documents, photos, and contracts into neat piles while she mumbled to herself, "So many years, so many signs I ignored." Her eyes met Walter's across the hall, sharing a moment of painful understanding about their voluntary blindness to the events that unfolded under their roof. Detective Rivera frowned as he examined the documents detailing Margaret's scheme. "This goes beyond simple business fraud," he commented, scribbling quick notes in his notebook. "We're talking about a criminal organization that specialized in destroying traditional family-owned businesses. And from what I'm seeing here, Collins's restaurant would have been just another one on a long list." His eyes rested on a folder marked "Next Targets" that had been recovered from Margaret's office. Walter finally stood up, his heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden floor as he approached Emma. All this time, his voice trembled with contained emotion. "You carried the Parker legacy, and I didn't realize. Grace, your mother. She was like a sister to my first wife." Silent tears streamed down his weathered face as he placed his hands on the girl's shoulders. "Forgive me for not seeing it sooner, for allowing Margaret." His voice failed, unable to complete the thought. The forensic experts had spread out across the restaurant, photographing and collecting evidence. One of them, examining the walk-in cooler where Emma had been locked, discovered scratch marks on the door, silent evidence of other possible past victims. "Detective," he called out, "I think we need to dig deeper here. There's something we're not seeing." The officer approached, his flashlight revealing disturbing details on the metal walls. Emma, watching the investigators work, felt a chill run down her spine. "How many others?" she thought aloud. "How many other people did Margaret hurt before me?" Walter placed his coat over the girl's shoulders, noticing how she trembled, not just from the cold, but from the realization of the extent of the crimes they had uncovered. A young officer rushed into the hall, his face flushed from running. "Detective, we just received information about Margaret Hayes. She was seen boarding a private plane at the municipal airport. The logged destination is..." He hesitated, consulting his notes. "Miami City." Emma felt her heart tighten, the city where it had all started, where her parents had died. Yolanda approached Walter with a folder of documents that made his face turn pale. "Sir," she said softly, "I found the real financial records for the restaurant, what Margaret was showing you. They were all fake, but the reality..." She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the papers. "It's much worse than we imagined." Detective Rivera, sensing the gravity of the situation, began organizing a task force. "We need to move fast," he declared, issuing orders over the radio. "Margaret Hayes isn't just a local criminal. This is an interstate operation, and if she makes it to Miami..." His words hung in the air like an unspoken threat. Walter examined the documents with growing horror. Years of financial manipulation had left Collins' restaurant on the brink of total collapse. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered, his hands shaking as he turned each page. "She not only stole our money, she destroyed everything we built." Emma watched, her heart breaking at the evident anguish of the man who had tried to help her. The officers began gathering their belongings, preparing to transfer the investigation to a broader level. "Miss Parker," Detective Rivera called out, "we're going to need your help to piece together this whole story. Your memories of your parents' restaurant could be the key to unraveling Margaret's entire scheme." Emma nodded gravely, feeling the weight of responsibility on her young shoulders. Yolanda found one last folder, hidden in a secret compartment of Margaret's desk. Inside it, one document made her blood run cold. "Walter," she called urgently. "The restaurant. Margaret mortgaged everything, the building, the equipment, everything. It's all encumbered with loans in your name." Her words fell like stones in the silence of the hall. The sun was beginning to rise over New Orleans, its first rays filtering through the restaurant's windows. Walter, Emma, and Yolanda found themselves alone in the main dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of a lifetime of lies. "What are we going to do now?" Emma asked, her voice small but determined. Walter looked at her, seeing not just the Parker's daughter, but also the last hope for saving his beloved restaurant. "First," he said with a firmness that surprised them all. "We go after Margaret. She may have fled with some documents, but we—" His voice was interrupted by the shrill ringing of the restaurant's phone. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice made Emma freeze. "Did you really think it was over, little Parker? The game is just beginning." The morning sun illuminated the renovated facade of Colin's restaurant, where a discreet plaque announced Chef Emma Parker below the traditional name of the establishment. 6 months had passed since the dramatic night that exposed Margaret's crimes, and the place had been reborn from the ashes of its own destruction. The aroma of fresh spices and traditional Mexican seasonings permeated the air, while Emma, now officially the head chef at 13 years old, coordinated her team with the precision and passion inherited from her parents. "Every dish that comes out of this kitchen carries our story," she constantly reminded her assistants, her small but firm hands finalizing each presentation with the characteristic dedication of the Parkers. Ana Martinez, the new administrator hired by Walter after an extensive search, analyzed the accounting books with evident satisfaction. Her delicate framed glasses reflected the spreadsheets, showing an impressive financial recovery. "Reservations are booked for the next 3 months," she informed Walter, her professionalism tempered by a genuine smile. "And the return on the initial investment has already exceeded all projections. Emma is not only an exceptional chef, she is our greatest asset." The old restaurateur nodded, observing the bustle in the kitchen through the half-open door with paternal pride. Yolanda, in her new role as operations manager, oversaw the dining room with the efficiency born of 15 years of dedication finally recognized. Her promotion had been one of the new administration's first decisions, and her experience was proving invaluable in rebuilding the restaurant's reputation. "Table 12 asks to meet the chef," she announced, entering the kitchen. "It's the critic from El Gourmet. Seems the buzz about the return of the Parker recipes has reached the international press." In the kitchen, now impeccably organized and modernized, Emma implemented a system that blended the traditions learned from her parents with her own innovations. The old copper pots, a legacy from the restaurant's golden age, shone again under the lights while contemporary techniques were applied to classic dishes. "The secret lies in respecting the ingredients," she explained to a young assistant, adjusting the seasoning of a traditional sauce. "As my mother always said, food knows when it's prepared with love." Walter, witnessing the transformation of his beloved restaurant, could hardly believe the speed of the recovery. The debt left by Margaret, although still significant, was consistently decreasing thanks to Anna's competent management and Emma's extraordinary talent. The dishes coming out of the kitchen were not just meals, but gastronomic works of art that told stories of perseverance and rebirth. "It's as if the Parkers themselves were guiding our hands," he commented to Yolanda, his voice choked with emotion. News of the restaurant's transformation spread rapidly through New Orleans. Gastronomic critics lined up to experience the dishes that combined tradition and innovation. "The young chef Parker has achieved the impossible," wrote a renowned critic. She not only honored her parents' legacy, but elevated it to new heights. Each positive review was like a balm on the wounds left by Margaret's months of sabotage. Anna gathered the team before the evening service, her eyes shining with excitement over another positive news. "The gastronomic guide has named us Comeback of the Year," she announced, raising the day's newspaper. The kitchen erupted in restrained celebrations, professionalism maintained even in joy. Emma, at the center of the celebration, thought of her parents and how proud they would be of this moment. Detective Rivera made regular visits, not only as a customer, but to keep the team informed about the ongoing investigation. "Margaret's network was bigger than we imagined," he revealed during one of his meals. "But every restaurant she destroyed is being contacted. Some have already started their own recovery processes, inspired by your story." Yolanda, ever attentive to details, created a discreet mural near the kitchen entrance where old photographs of the restaurant mingled with clippings of recent positive reviews. It was a daily reminder of the journey they had traveled, from near destruction to rebirth. "So we never forget where we came from," she explained to the new employees, "and always remember what we are capable of." The nights at the restaurant now had a different rhythm. The sound of cutlery and animated conversations mingled with exclamations of pleasure at each new dish served. Emma occasionally stepped out of the kitchen to greet the customers, her immaculate chef's uniform proudly bearing the Parker name embroidered. "Every recipe has a story," she explained to the curious. "Every flavor is a preserved memory." Walter, observing the packed dining room from his usual spot near the bar, finally felt he had done justice to the legacy of his first wife. The restaurant was not just a successful business now, it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. "Grace would be proud," he murmured, as another group of satisfied customers bid farewell with smiles and promises to return. Anna kept a watchful eye on the finances, ensuring that present success built a solid foundation for the future. Her experience in recovering traditional businesses was proving to be exactly what the restaurant needed. "In 6 months," she explained during a meeting, "we've managed to pay off 40% of the debts left by Margaret. Keeping this pace, in a year, we'll be completely free from the past." Emma dedicated her mornings to developing new dishes, combining the traditions documented in the Parker recipe book with her own creativity. Each creation was exhaustively tested before making it onto the menu, maintaining the standard of excellence that had made the restaurant famous again. "The kitchen is a place of constant evolution," she taught her team. "But we must never forget our roots." At the end of another successful night, as the team organized everything for the next day, Emma went up to the restaurant's rooftop, her favorite place for reflection. New Orleans stretched out before her, twinkling lights reminiscent of the stars she used to gaze at during her nights on the streets. Walter found her there, as he often did. "You know," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "sometimes I think about Margaret, how she's out there somewhere." Walter nodded, understanding her concern. "And when she comes back," he replied with quiet confidence, "we'll be ready. Because now we're stronger than ever. This is just the beginning of our story, little Parker." Far from there, the New Orleans Women's Correctional Center was a gray, imposing structure, where Margaret Hayes, formerly the elegant restaurant saboteur, now wore a faded orange uniform that contrasted grotesquely with her former designer outfits. Captured in a joint operation between Miami and the United States, she had been sentenced to 30 years for multiple crimes, including fraud, corporate sabotage, and involvement in the Parker incident. "Hey, fancy rat!" yelled one of the inmates as Margaret was shoved into the prison kitchen. "Time to show off your culinary skills." The cruel sneer of the inmate's leader echoed the very malice Margaret had shown towards Emma. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, were now rough and stained from the forced labor in the prison kitchen, where she was compelled to prepare meals for hundreds of inmates. Sweat poured down her face as she leaned over the large pots, the stifling kitchen heat making her once impeccably styled hair cling to her forehead. Each dish she prepared was met with disdain and mockery. "You call that food?" the inmates taunted, flinging portions of rice in her face. "Even rats cook better than you." The words were stabs at her pride, cruelly reminding her of the very humiliations she had inflicted on Emma. After kitchen service, Margaret was forced to clean the entire dining hall. A tiny brush, similar to the one she had given Emma, was her only tool. Her knees ached from prolonged contact with the cold floor, as the other inmates purposefully walked through freshly cleaned areas, leaving mud and dirt trails. "Oops, looks like you'll have to start over, princess." They laughed, watching Margaret swallow her pride and restart the work. The nights were the worst. The guards, who had been informed of her crimes against a child, turned a blind eye to the special treatment she received from the other inmates. Margaret was locked in an isolated cell in the basement of the prison, known for its rat infestation. The rodents, fat and bold, competed with her for the scraps of food thrown through the small opening in the door. "How's it feel to share dinner with your cousins, restaurant rat?" the guards mocked, watching through the small cell window as Margaret huddled in a corner, trying to protect the meager pieces of bread she managed to snatch before the rats. The sound of tiny scurrying paws kept her awake, her nerves on edge at every squeak and movement in the shadows. During the day, as she scrubbed endless corridors with her tiny brush, Margaret overheard inmates commenting on the success of Restaurant Collins under Emma's direction. "Did you see the magazine article?" one would say. "The little chef is making history, and to think that woman tried to destroy her." The remarks were constant needles at her conscience, reminding her of her monumental failure. In her solitary nights, amid the squeaks of rats and the chill of isolation, Margaret was tormented by memories of her lost empire. Her nails, once perfectly manicured, were now bitten and dirty. Her face, which had once worn a mask of sophistication, bore the deep marks of time and belated regret. "Enough!" she screamed one night, as a particularly bold rat tried to snatch a piece of bread directly from her hand. "I was someone. I had power. I controlled an empire." Her screams echoed through the empty prison corridors, mingling with the laughter of the other inmates. "And now, you're nothing but another rat in our colony," an anonymous voice replied, followed by a wave of guffaws. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. Every humiliation she suffered was a precise reflection of what she had inflicted on Emma. The rats that now terrified her were the very ones she had used to torment the girl. The floor she scrubbed endlessly was her penance for every moment of cruelty she had imposed on others. On a particularly cold night, as she huddled on her thin mattress trying to ignore the rats feasting on the remains of her last meal, Margaret finally broke. A primal scream of rage and despair tore from her throat, echoing through the prison corridors. "This isn't fair," she bellowed, pounding her fists against the walls of her cell. "I don't deserve this. I'm not a rat. I'm not." But the only ones who answered were the rats, their squeak seeming to mock her protests as the other inmates shouted back, "Welcome to your new home, fancy rat. Hope you're enjoying your own poison." Margaret sank to the floor, her elegance completely shattered, finally understanding the true meaning of poetic justice. In her dark, infested cell, she had become exactly what she had so despised, a prisoner of her own cruelty, forced to live the very humiliations she had once inflicted on an innocent little girl. The sun set over Miami, painting the sky with shades of orange and crimson that reminded Emma of the delicate sauces she had learned to prepare with her mother. Walter drove along the familiar avenue, glancing at the young chef beside him, who kept her eyes obediently blindfolded as he had insisted. "Are we there yet?" she asked for the 10th time, her voice betraying the mixture of anxiety and anticipation she felt. "Almost there," Walter replied, his heart racing as he turned the last corner. After a year of hard work and financial recovery from Colin's restaurant, he could finally realize the dream he had kept secret for months. The old Parker restaurant, closed since Grace and James's tragic deaths, had been completely renovated under his discreet supervision. When he finally parked, Walter helped Emma out of the car, carefully positioning her on the sidewalk. "Ready?" he asked, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the knot of the blindfold. The sound of the surrounding city seemed to diminish, as if the moment itself held its breath. As he removed the blindfold, Emma's emotional sigh echoed through the nearly empty street. Before her, the Parker restaurant had been reborn. The facade, once deteriorated by abandonment, now shone with a fresh coat of paint in the original colors she remembered from her childhood. The Art Deco sign had been restored to its former glory, the soft lights illuminating the name Parker like a beacon of memories. The large, clean windows revealed a completely renovated interior, maintaining the classic charm that had made the place one of the city's most beloved restaurants. "Happy 14th anniversary, little one," Walter said softly, placing an old key in Emma's trembling hand. "Your father gave me a copy of this key on the original opening day. Now, it belongs to you." Silent tears streamed down the young chef's face as she approached the door, each step weighted with memories. As she entered, Emma was greeted by an environment that seamlessly blended past and present. The layout of the tables was exactly as she remembered, but the furniture and equipment were new. The kitchen, visible through a modern opening, had been outfitted with the latest on the market, although her mother's carefully restored old copper pots held a place of honor. "Yolanda and Anna helped me with the details," Walter explained, watching Emma reverently touch each surface, recognizing textures and memories. "We wanted it to be the perfect surprise. The Collins is in good hands with them. And you're ready for your own flight." On the main wall, an enlarged photograph of Grace and James Parker smiled out into the dining room. Next to it, a framed article told the story of their daughter, the young chef who had overcome all adversities to keep the family's legacy alive. "Your parents would be so proud," Walter murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Emma finally reached the kitchen, her true home. The space had been designed to combine modern efficiency with the welcoming warmth that characterized Parker cuisine. "The grand opening is scheduled for 2 months from now," Walter explained. Enough time for you to assemble your team and develop the menu. Although, he smiled, something tells me you already have it all planned in your mind. In the center of the kitchen, on a new marble countertop, sat the Parker family's old recipe book, restored and bound in soft leather. Next to it, a new notebook awaited the creations Emma would develop, the next generation of family recipes. "The restaurant is yours," Walter said, "a gift for the amazing year you gave us at the Collins and for the extraordinary chef you've become." Emma finally turned to Walter, throwing her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "for believing in me when I was just a girl on the streets, for giving me a home when I had nothing, and now, for giving me back my story." The sun had fully set now, but the lights of the renovated restaurant shone like a beacon of hope in the Miami night. Walter and Emma remained there, sharing the comfortable silence of those who know a new chapter is about to begin. In the air, the spirits of Grace and James Parker hovered like a silent blessing, their recipes and love for cuisine living on through their daughter. "The Parker will live again," Emma said finally, her face alit with serene determination. "And this time no one will be able to knock us down." Walter smiled, knowing in his heart that the Parker legacy was in safe hands. The aroma of possibilities hung in the air, as rich and promising as the sauces that would soon perfume that historic kitchen once more. If you liked this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.